All right, so welcome back, everybody. We're here with Karen of Divine Time Astrology again. We're continuing our interview on astrology and relationships. And today we're going to look primarily at her thoughts, her experiences in astrology as an astrologer, looking at the nodes, Rahu and Ketu within the chart, as well as Saturn. And we'll also discuss the Indian method, the Vedic astrological method of Kuta Compatibility. So welcome back, Karen. It's good to see you again.
Yes, you too, Ryan. Thanks for having me on again. This is fun.
No problem. No problem. We'll do it one more time probably too. So I want to begin, we talked about Jupiter and Venus, two very important planets for relationships in our last video. And those of you who are tuning in for the first time, we've already done a video previously, so you can go back and learn more about Jupiter and Venus on the Ryan's Vedic Astrology YouTube channel, which you're watching. But for now, the question is, how do you find that the nodes, Rahu and Ketu, how do they influence a person's capacity to have a relationship, to be in a relationship? What's been your experience with that?
Well, if you have Rahu or Ketu with the moon, then that seems to intensify the difficulty with relationship. If it's with Venus, then, like, say, Ketu with Venus, I find for people that means, it seems to mean that they don't really need relationship as much, and they're more self-contained. And there's also a greater capacity for spiritual devotion. And every person that I've met who has Ketu with Venus, they tend to be very spiritually oriented. And what they're looking for in relationship is often something that can't be found on Earth, really.
With Ketu and Venus?
Yeah, Ketu with Venus. They want that spiritual soulmate with a man. And sometimes they find it, though. So, there's something very particular that they're looking for. Right. And then with Rahu and Venus, well, that's a especially difficult one because I like the way Ernst explained it, how Saturn and Rahu, their job is to show us our shadow, to show us the part of us that we disown, that we don't like to think is there. We have our values and we say, I will never do blah, 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 whatever. And then Rahu, however, when it's with Venus, especially, shows you, yeah, in certain circumstances, yes, you would. And we don't like that. So we don't experience that a good way. But if we understand that Rahu's doing us a service, because our ultimate goal is wholeness, and to become fully aware, fully conscious, then it just doesn't feel good when it's happening.
Right.
But it's a really important thing. And, all of us, even if it's not there in our natal chart, natally, like Rahu with Venus or Rahu aspect by Venus, transits, we get a taste of that through Rahu and Ketu transits.
So you find with Rahu and Venus, that brings out more sort of the unconscious, the instinctual side of love that a person might have to face. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it seems to intensify a person's desire.
Yes. Okay.
And it can be very obsessive. And I have Rahu aspecting my Venus. And I personally know from experience, I've had times in my life where I see somebody, like maybe somebody I'm taking a class with or somebody that I work with or whatever, and there's no relationship there between us because for whatever reason. But I could totally create one in my head.
Right.
And have this total fantasy life around that person who is not even anybody I know.
Right. Because Rahu is the fantasy aspect, and since it's with Venus, it deals with relationships. So then we see the fantasy of relationships coming out there.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And, I mean, I haven't done this in a really long time, obviously, being married, but Rahu's going to come and whack me for that one. But so I understand what that's about. I know what it feels like,
Right.
maybe because of shyness or because of a feeling of not being good enough or just timing. It could be anything.
Okay.
But I've just seen that a lot in relationships through the work that I do.
So aside from Venus and Rahu, when you look at the position of the nodes or the position of Rahu and Ketu in a person's chart, are there any particular positions that either support relationship, and I don't really know how possible that would be with the nodes anyway, or is there any particular positions that a person gets more difficulty within relationships, like by house or by sign or anything of that nature?
Yeah, Rahu in the fourth. That's
Oh, okay.
That's a really hard one, especially for women, because it has to do with the internal life, internal emotional life. And when you have Rahu there, then that means that on some level, it's very difficult for you to trust. There's a lot of trust issues. Same thing with Rahu in the eighth, and Rahu in the seventh. It draws you into relationship, but you kind of go kicking and screaming. And at the same time, there's a longing for relationship. I've noticed one of two things. Either it's the thing that the person is all about when Rahu's in the seventh, or it's the thing they talk about continually, even obsessively, yet they can never quite take that step.
Right.
And it depends on what else is in the seventh house too.
Yeah, well, that makes sense, because if Rahu's in the seventh, they're going to have a natural sort of craving or obsession for that. Mm-hmm. And if they're confident, or if they're believe in themselves, they'll probably follow it. They might not get the satisfaction they want. And if they're not, then they're still going to be obsessed about it, but they're probably going to spend more time, like you said, thinking about it or talking about it rather than, say, getting involved in it.
Yeah, I noticed that there's a lot of online stuff.
Yeah.
Like people can make like a career out of being an online dater.
Right.
Where they never actually get together with the person, or the person that they're interested in is in some other country. Mm-hmm. And you have to spend a lot of money just to go investigate it.
Right. And that makes sense too, because Rahu represents foreigners.
Yes, that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Now, however, I have to say something about horary here again.
Okay.
Horary can save you a ton of money.
How so?
Well, say for instance, you're talking to somebody online that you met from another country. We can do the compatibility if you get their birth data. My clients are very good at doing that, getting their birth data. And we'll look at using the Vedic compatibility technique and whether or not it's even worth pursuing. And if there's enough there, then the horary technique will tell you whether or not will actually be a relationship.
Right.
Because just because you're compatible with somebody doesn't mean you're going to have a relationship with them.
Correct.
So it can save you airfare, hotel expenses, all those things. And the great thing about it too is that it can also puncture any crazy fantasy life you've built up around it.
Right.
From getting, out of control there.
Yeah. Well, that's good information. That's very good information. And so from the seventh house, looking at the fourth and the eighth, that makes sense too, because the fourth house represents our emotional stability, or how we feel emotionally. So if Rahu's there, we can have some difficulty either feeling emotional stability or a lot of fears around it, which will come out in relationships. Right. And the eighth house, which is that house of sexuality, we look at it as sexuality, but really it's that idea of the conjugal bond, that ability to connect deeply with someone else. And if we have Rahu there, then that can show a difficulty finding that connection. Is that how you see it, or is there?
That's part of it, and also it's hard for the person to believe that it's okay for them to see their partner's resources as being theirs too.
Right.
So they tend to be overly self-sufficient and not able to receive.
Right, and that's because of Ketu in the second.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Rahu in the first too. Rahu in the first, I've noticed, especially with men, they tend to be bachelors, unless they have other things going on in their chart that makes it possible for them to connect with a person and actually get married. But oftentimes I see that it's in the ascendant for men who are bachelors, even still in their late 40s and 50s. And that's because they're supposed to be developing themselves, their own self with a capital S.
Right.
And it's okay. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them, except I guess you could say for a relationship, you have to have a lot of qualities like that too, in order for you to be in a good relationship with a person who is here to really to be selfish.
Right. Well, and that's an important point of astrology. Two things. Number one, when we're considering the nodes of the moon, we can make these blanket statements, but we do, as you mentioned, need to consider the rest of the chart. So even if someone does have Rahu and Ketu in the ascendant or in the seventh house, that doesn't have to mean they're going to be a bachelor, or it doesn't have to mean that they're going to treat these in negative fashion, because if the Lord of the Rahu and Ketu are in good dignity, the person's more likely to work with it well. And if the ruler of that house is in a good position, like an angle or a trine, or well supported through avashtas, that can also help them work well with those issues. So it doesn't, I guess I'm asking, it doesn't necessarily mean that because Rahu and Ketu are in these places, that those areas of life are just doomed. It really requires that you look at the rest of the chart too, correct?
Yes, because if you have Rahu in the ascendant, then you have Ketu in the seventh, which means that you're a really good partner. Sometimes so good that you completely lose yourself.
Right.
And I see this a lot with women who have that. They their whole life revolves around their partnership. And I had one woman come to me and ask me if she made a mistake in leaving her husband, because she was having trouble, she was struggling with her career and her job, and she was thinking, well, I left a cozy nest. Was that a big mistake, right? And she told me when that happened, and her birth chart showed, no, it was a Ketu period. And so I asked her, I said, so did your whole life revolve around your husband? Did you have your own interests? Did you have your own goals or anything? And she said, no, I didn't. She said, just one day I knew I had to go. And I told her, I said, well, that's exactly what you were supposed to do. That was your soul saying, look, time to come out of the cozy nest and develop yourself now. And she was so relieved by that. So she could stop obsessing over, oh man, did I make a big mistake?
Right. And that's true, because if you didn't have astrology, it would only be left up to the what if. It would never have resolution. So,
yes.
Well, good. Well, speaking of resolution, and we'll move on to Saturn, who is often the resolver of our life. As you mentioned, we're all going to die in our past video. Which is funny. I probably already mentioned on this channel, but I was supposed to give a talk at Unity a couple months ago, and I have a fairly prominent Saturn. Somehow, in the middle of the sermon I was giving, I started saying things like, "Well, you're all going to die anyway." So, so I tried to pull that out. But anyway, to Saturn. So when you're looking at relationships and Saturn, what are the qualities that, when Saturn influences a relationship or partner, what are the qualities that Saturn shares? And I'm asking this question because a lot of people are afraid of Saturn. Can Saturn be good for relationships? So that's my questions to you.
Yes, Saturn can be great for relationships because he is the reality principle. And if you have Saturn in a good position to Venus, for instance, it just means that you don't tend to live in a fantasy world when it comes to relationships. You're not always looking for the person that fits your ideal. You tend to be a lot more forgiving of the way a person, their humanness, their flaws, their, the fact that they are mortal. And you are grateful for what you get, because Saturn's attitude is, I'm not going to get anything, I don't deserve anything.
So when you do get something, you appreciate it.
You appreciate it more, yes. And sometimes Saturn in certain positions in a person's birth chart too can give them qualities of being very reliable and dependable because Saturn is dutiful.
Mm.
You know, he'll do his duty no matter what. And my husband, his Atmakaraka is Saturn. And I've known him forever. Okay, I met him in high school. And one of his most outstanding qualities in all the years that I've known him
is that he's handsome and masculine, right?
And formidable.
And formidable, yes, yes.
Absolutely. But that he's dependable. You know, when I was younger, of course, I thought that was boring. I loved it in a friendship, but as a boyfriend or husband, it was just kind of boring. However, as I got older, that completely changed, especially after I had a child. Then being dependable and reliable became really sexy.
Yeah.
But it was like, wow, I really love this quality about you. And also he has a strong sun too, so he has this consistency, this steadfastness.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and you bring up some important points there. Number one is that partially, you know, Saturn dealing with reality, it's very different than, say, a Mars-Venus combination in relationships, or even Mars-Venus-Rahu or Venus-Rahu, where there can be a lot of ideas about passion and expectations. Mm-hmm. And as we know in relationships, that the passionate aspect of it's actually a chemical going on in our brain, which is equivalent to heroin, which lasts about 7 to 8 months, and then it falls off, and we wonder, gee, what's going on? Which is why a lot of relationships fall apart. Right. But when Saturn's strong, then you're able to see the reality of what it takes to make a relationship work.
Right.
You know, and just to remember, because we did talk about Saturn a little bit in our last conversation, is that we're not talking about Saturn with Venus, right? We're talking about, say, Saturn and Venus aspecting each other because they're friends.
Yeah, either
right.
The Gemini aspects or the Parashara aspects. It doesn't seem to matter.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that, because when Saturn is with a planet,
it's different. It's just a lot harder.
Right.
Just because there's just that sense of there never being, that we're not enough, or that the partner isn't enough.
Right.
And there's pain, because Venus is the comforter. Mm-hmm. And when Saturn's with Venus, then we have a much harder time comforting ourselves.
Yes.
You know, mentally, emotionally, physically. So it's a tough one. I would say that is probably one of the more painful combinations.
Yeah, good. Well, good. It's good to get these perspectives, just because I do think Saturn gets such a bad rap, and he does cause, he shows where our suffering will be or where our responsibilities are. But, you know, when he's in a certain position, when he's in good dignity, and he's with a good aspect from Venus, or even benefic planets in general, he can give exactly what you described, the more maturity, the longer term capacity for relationships.
Now, I want to point out something, though. Even if a person has that, they may spend like the first half of their life struggling with it.
Yes.
But the great thing about Saturn is that it gets better as you get older. Mm-hmm. And as you mature, especially if you're actively, consciously working with this, that combination, there comes a point when it's not so painful anymore. And you actually grow from it. And that's right. Part of why Saturn even exists in our universe, our solar system.
Right.
You know, he's the whip or the stick, of God, and the staff. Mm-hmm. And he's the one who, because of the way we're made, we seem to not really grow unless we're
poked.
Forced to.
Yeah. Understandable. Okay. That's a good way to put it.
The soul sets it up like that.
Right. Well, that is an important point of Saturn, is that that idea of suffering, so many people look at it in a negative fashion, when really, when a person meditates and when a person starts to really explore what is God, versus the idea of God must be the all-loving being, whatever. Well, God is everything, which means the good things, the bad things, which is why astrology is that Vishnu path of learning to see everything as God. And it's a really it's painful yet sweet. It's like this heart-melting experience where you realize that even the tragedies, even the hard things that happen in life, that is also an aspect of, if we want to put it into words, like divine love.
Yeah.
And it's hard for us to understand that when it's happening, because we think, oh my God, what's happening? But really it's showing us that every experience is this capacity for growth or maturity or learning something that you might not have been able to appreciate before, whether it's more compassion for other people who've gone through that. Saturn's really hard in that way, but also very helpful if you're able to embrace it, which is why so many of the religions, so many spiritual practices are really about surrender. As Ramana Maharshi would say, he says, just surrender and be done with it. He says, don't just surrender when the good things are happening. He says, surrender when the good and the bad are happening and be done with it. So it's
there's a scripture that I really like from the Old Testament, and that is from Job. Job said, even though thou slay me, still I will follow you.
Right.
Still I will love you. And yesterday, I have a little dog, and you know how it is with pets. There's just no reservations.
Right.
You just love them. You can't even help it. And I was thinking about her inevitable death. I do these kinds of things. I think about that kind of stuff. And I was thinking, we're in for it. It's going to really be painful when she dies. But then I thought right after that, and it's totally worth it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's another thing about Saturn, when it's
right.
in a good relationship to
Well, that is an interesting point. Because I've often made the comment before that, having friends, having pets, having children, having loved ones, we're just asking to have our teeth kicked in.
Exactly.
Because we love them. But what's going to happen? Well, as you put it so eloquently, we're all going to die.
Yeah.
And not to be joking, but that's sort of the point. It's worth it anyway. That's sort of how life goes. But anyway,
it's to stretch the heart is what I think.
Right.
So that you can receive more, and because it's going to go away anyway. And and that's the other thing too that Saturn helps you to realize, and that is that while the good times end, the bad times do too.
Right.
Nothing sticks around forever.
Right. Well, let's bring it up a notch.
Okay.
Think about Jupiter just for a moment. Okay. So there, now we feel better. So let's take our final question for this part of the interview. And I want to ask you about the Kuta Compatibility. How you use that in your sessions, how you find that to be very helpful. Just what is your experience with the Indian method of Kuta Compatibility?
Well, I love it. I think it is the greatest thing ever. And of course, I've studied a lot of synastry and, compatibility astrology techniques. And this one, though, is just superior, and in my opinion and my experience. It has actually answered questions for me that I literally couldn't find anywhere else. And I'm the kind of person who's always looking, for certain answers, because there's certain questions. If you think about it, you'll notice that you have certain questions that you've had your whole life, and that you're always, getting more and more a clearer picture about the answer to. And that one, it just explains the most amazing things, like how just because of the numerical position of the moons from each other, no matter how great your relationship skills are, you just can't make it work with that person because you weren't meant to.
Right.
Because there are these spiritual laws in force that are greater than anything else. And that alone has relieved so much pain and suffering for people. It's incredible. I mean, it's like the greatest healing tool for relationships too. I like to do what I call relationship autopsies, where you can look at a past relationship and see exactly what that was about.
You need to make a radio show called Astrological Relationship Autopsies.
Wouldn't that be fun?
That would be a great one. I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt, but it just seemed like such a good idea.
It does, actually. It sounds like a great idea. But you know how it is. You know, you break up with somebody, and then pretty soon you get these things solidified in your mind. It was like, okay, that was his fault. This was my fault. But when you look at it in the context of the Vedic compatibility technique, it can tell a completely different story. And that is, it was nobody's fault. You know, you did your best with what you could and what you did know at the time.
Right.
And if you had been more mature or knew about this technique, you would have let go of it a lot sooner.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and there would have been a lot less wear and tear on each other.
Right.
You know, because when you're not meant to be together, if there are certain things not in the compatibility, like Veda, for instance, the obstacles, you can never seem to get together. Or the Raju is when you get together, you know, things just kind of go insane. Then you understand that it gets rid of fault and blame.
Right. Okay. Well, good. Yeah, it is a pretty complicated system, but I think you explained it fairly well in regards to how it can help an individual. So let's go ahead and conclude there for today for this part of the interview. And we'll pick up next time looking at how what you can use astrology for to improve relationships, how to improve relationships, and what might be the limits to the capacity of astrology and relationships. So thank you again for tuning in, and we'll continue with our last installment next time.
See you then.
Okay, thanks.
Bye.